First of all, I would like to thank all the organizers for putting together this wonderful workshop. It was amazing, and I expect more fantastic philosophical events coming up. So the talk I'm having today is a work in progress. So that might be one of the last occasions to stop me before I will make some deadly mistakes. So as you can see, the title of the talk is Content Bearers and Indexicality. So I shall be addressing certain issues that are connected with cognitive dynamics that is associated with uses of indexicals, or indexical thought rather. But at the very same time, as you will see, I will go towards something like a more conservative solution or approach to the idea of indexicality of thought. So here is the plan. I shall start with describing a certain problem that is a point of departure for this talk. Then I shall say a few words about the concept of transparency of content, of mental content. Then I shall very briefly mention some possible reactions to the initial problem. And I will finish the talk with presenting a kind of a proposal of addressing the problem that will be something I call hybrid solution. And as you can see, there is also a point devoted to some problems of the theory, but as you can see, it's in brackets. It means that I might leave it for the discussion. So I don't know if I will be discussing that point. Maybe if not, we might go back to this point during the discussion. Okay. So let me start with the problem. So the problem is well known. So it's already mentioned several times, a version of Rip van Winkle problem, actually. So in my case, it's Pierre, not Rip. So maybe it's Pierre van Winkle. I don't know. We might say something like that here. So Pierre is, of course, a very known philosophical character. So imagine that Pierre thinks to himself on one particular day, truthfully, today is sunny, okay? And I will use those M's over there to indicate that what we talk about here are thoughts, okay, not utterances. That's important. I won't be talking here about utterances, but about thoughts or mental episodes, okay? So M is referring here to a mental episode, okay? So he's having a thought, today is sunny. Now let's, as in the Rip van Winkle story, envision that he falls into slumber and awakens on another day, D prime, which is distinct from the day that comes after the initial day, and he's unaware of the extended rest. And therefore, he believes that he woke up on the day that is after the initial day D. Okay, so that's important. And on that day, D prime, he thinks to himself, yesterday was sunny, okay? And let us assume, this is not very important, but it will make certain considerations a bit easier, that it wasn't sunny on the D prime minus 1, so the day before the day at which he awakened, okay? So that's the story. So the story on the picture is like that. So as you can see, we have a day D, it's sunny on day D, and we have a mental representation today is sunny, and we have the prime day, and we have the thought yesterday was sunny, and it was raining on D prime minus 1, but of course the essence of the story is that Pierre believes that he actually woke up the day after D, so the day at which it was sunny. So the question we might raise here is the following. Is the content of the thought today is sunny in this particular scenario the same as the content of the thought yesterday was sunny? And why this question is interesting? It is interesting because I think when we consider that question in general, then we might have a conflicting intuitions regarding that question. Because on the one hand, one might say, okay, it's very clear that Pierre is having in mind when thinking, yesterday was sunny, a day that came after D. Okay, so in that sense, when we kind of stick to referential content at least, then today is sunny and yesterday was sunny probably might be interpreted as having the same content. But one might object to this and say, no, of course, since the Pierre awakes on D prime, of course, we have to say explicitly that his thought is really about D prime minus 1, okay? And of course, in this case, we have to go into the direction of saying that the content of the two thoughts is different. So I think we have those views, two views over there, and there is a kind of a conflict of intuitions in which way to go, okay? And I think that this issue is especially problematic for the case of thoughts. I don't think it is similarly problematic for the case of utterances. So if we will go back to the scenario and move from thoughts to utterances, then we might go, we have a kind of family of solutions that came to our mind. So for instance, this is just one example. We might employ for the analysis of utterance cases, we might follow François Recanati's proposal and say that here something like a distinction between speaker's reference and semantic reference comes at play, okay? We might go in that direction, so it's pretty fine for utterances. But I don't think that there is a similar solution, at least not directly, available in the case of thoughts. So it's quite interesting to see what kind of analysis of those kinds of cases can be provided in case of thoughts. So let's now move to transparency, because the problem, I think, is especially touching if we answer to this initial question with no, okay, by saying that the content of the two thoughts, the contents of the two thoughts are distinct. So if we follow that way, then of course we have this general idea of transparency of mental content that has already been mentioned and will be mentioned several times, I think, especially during the second workshop. But this is the well-known quote from Boghossian, and in that quote, Boghossian proposes to divide this principle of transparency into two sub-principles, the one which he calls the transparency of sameness, and the other that he calls the transparency of difference. And according to the two proposals, we say that if two of a thinker's token thoughts possess the same content, then the thinker must be able to know a priori that they do, and if two of the thinker's token thoughts possess distinct contents, then the thinker must be able to know a priori that they do. So those are the two principles. And if we kind of accept those principles, of course, we know that they generate certain problems that are broadly discussed in the literature, but if we accept those principles, especially the second one, so the one that I bolded here, then of course we might kind of form a problem for the person who says no as the answer to the initial question. So let's just use X to stand for extension and cont for content. If we use such symbols, then we might start with the simple assumption, which is just a matter of what we put in our story. So Pierre believes that the content of today is sunny is identical with the content of yesterday was sunny. That's, of course, due to the fact that he thinks that he woke up on the very next day. And so this is one assumption. And the other, of course, is that since we reply no, okay, so this is a no reply, then we say that true values in those cases are distinct, so extensions are distinct. So those are kind of assumptions, and if we have the two, then of course, from two, by using the principle of content extension determination, we might infer that the contents of the two thoughts are distinct. Then from one, so the observation that Pierre believes that the content of one thought is identical with the content of the other, and the principle, which is quite obvious, that believing in something entails not knowing that it is not the case, we might infer that Pierre does not know that the contents are distinct, okay? And if we have this, then when we combine 3 and 4 together, then we have a conflict with the principle of transparency, strictly speaking, with the thesis of the transparency of difference, okay? The second one. This is why I bolded that principle in the presentation. This is, of course, because on the one hand, contents are distinct, and on the other hand, Pierre doesn't know that. Okay, so that's why we have a conflict with the principle of transparency. So people who answer no to that question should do something with that. And what are the possible reactions? So the one possible reaction is something that goes along the popular multiple proposition approach in one way or another. So we might say, well, we have to consider more than one notion of content. We have to propose a certain special kind of content, like let's call it content S, and say that perhaps the thoughts have the same content as, but they differ in ordinary content. Okay, we might go like this. So I don't have any knockdown argument against this kind of approach. So maybe I would like to just stress that not every notion of content, special notion of content, will help us there. So here I use as an example the Perry's notion of reflexive content, but this is not due to the fact that Perry ever said something like this. This is just an illustration, to be strict. So if you want to have this content as a reflexive content, then of course it won't help us in the replying to our puzzle at all, because both at the level of reflexive contents and at the level of referential contents, here we have to admit that the contents are different. So it will not help us at all. So, maybe we might go in another direction, which I called toadlessness for rescue. And here, the idea is that sometimes we can be mistaken whether our thoughts have any content at all. Or, to put it in another way, whether we entertain any thought at all, even, we might say it like this. So it's Klaus here, but it should be Pierre. So one might say that Pierre on day D prime is mistaking just such a way. So this is a kind of analogous strategy to the one that Evans applied to the idea of object-dependent thoughts. As you probably know, for object-dependent thoughts, Evans was proposing that in the case in which there is no object, no reference, there is no thought. Okay, so this is this way of thinking about those cases. So here, I think this way to go is okay, but it fits a different stories than the one I sketched at the very beginning. So this is the story in which we're also dealing with the fact of being lost in time. Okay, but in that version of the story, we kind of stress that Pierre knows that he lost his sense of time. Okay? So if we go in that direction, then of course this way of approaching the problem is quite fine. And as Pavel Tichy rightly pointed out for utterances, for such cases we might say that someone who does not know the circumstances cannot be expected to know what sense has in fact been expressed. In the present case, the relevant circumstance is the time of utterance, and the time is exactly what our speaker is imagined to have lost track of. Thus, whatever the utterance is his own or somebody else's, the speaker will not know exactly what it expresses. In other words, he will not understand it. So this is the way in which we react to that. But this is not intuitive approach to our puzzle or our question, because in our case, we are not saying that the Pierre, in our case, knows that he doesn't know the circumstances. Okay? In our case, actually, Pierre believes that he is in correct circumstances, so to speak. So saying that his thought lacks content is a kind of a desperate move, I would say. So probably this is not a good solution, but now we come with the solution which I call conservative one. And according to that solution, we say something like that indexicality, properly understood, is property of content bearers, not of the contents themselves. And if, according to that approach, if we assume that we have a correct, good theory of content bearers, then maybe we will be able to show how to analyze the difficult cases like the one I just presented. And I would like to develop that point a bit here. So this is how I would like to do that. So my starting point is the theory of hybrid names or hybrid expressions, as probably one should rather say in this case. So the idea was mentioned in the previous talk, but let me very briefly give you the hint behind this approach. So this approach is usually connected with some ideas of Frege and his utterances like the one you have in quotes, where Frege says, circumstances accompanying the utterance are used as a means of expressing the thought. Okay? So the idea here, at least in one of the interpretations of this and other passages of Frege, is that in certain cases, especially the cases involving indexicals, actually what is the expression in the proper sense is not just a purely linguistic item, but purely linguistic item combined with some extra linguistic factor. Okay, so for instance, when I am telling something about this microphone by, let's say, touching it like this and uttering this microphone, then the expression this microphone combined with the gesture I'm making together combined a hybrid proper name or hybrid expression. Okay, so that's the idea. It's of course extended to other cases. And this hybrid name view was developed by several authors, and there are differences between those theories, and I'm not going to talk about those differences here, but common to all those approaches is this idea of taking those hybrids as properly conceived linguistic expressions in some broader sense. So we might formulate this hybrid expression hypothesis by saying something like that. Indexicals and demonstratives are particular kinds of hybrid expressions incorporating both linguistic components in the strict and narrow sense and extra-linguistic circumstances. Only such complete hybrid expressions can be recognized as bearers of content and other semantic properties. Okay? So in Frege's words, only such object can have senses, okay, as Frege might have been interpreted. So this is the general idea. Of course, this idea in this version applies to linguistic expressions. So it's the idea about utterances. But we want to talk here about thoughts, not just only about utterances. So we have to extend this hybrid expression hypothesis into something I call here hybrid thought hypothesis, which goes along the following line. So we say now something like this. Some vehicles of thoughts, mental representations, or mental forms, as I sometimes will be preferring to say, are hybrid representations, which include both syntactic formal components and extra-syntactic, extra-formal circumstances. Only such complete hybrid representations can be recognized as bearers of content as well as other semantic properties. So this is just a reformulation of the initial hybrid expression hypothesis into hybrid thought hypothesis. Of course, we have to change certain things. So instead of talking about expressions, we have to talk about syntactic or formal components of thoughts, okay? Certain mental forms, probably, of one way or another. And thusly formulated, the hybrid thought hypothesis is, of course, not very helpful. This is not very helpful because actually what we have here in mind initially is something I call here externalistic version of that hypothesis. And what do we mean by that here? I mean here by that the extra formal, extra representational circumstances are usually understood in a way that put them in the external world. Okay, so they are not internal to the mind, they are something external. And of course, if we go that way, it won't allow us to provide any analysis of the interesting cases. However, we might kind of consider a version or small switch in the hybrid thought hypothesis in which we move from the extra formal, external to the mind representation to the internal or just representations of the relevant circumstances in which thoughts occur, okay? Or which rather might be considered as a potential circumstances in which thoughts occur. So according to that version, we say something like that some vehicles of thought mental representations are hybrid representations, which include both, and again we repeat that, syntactic formal components, and this is the crucial difference, and the representations of extra-syntactic, extra-formal circumstances. So from circumstances, we move to representations of circumstances, and we say that those representations of circumstances are hybrid components of hybrid representations, not expressions, because we're talking about mental states. And of course, we add, as in the previous cases, that only such hybrids can be subjects of semantic properties. So to compare that in the table, on the left side you have externalistic version of the hybrid thought hypothesis, and on the right hand you have an internalistic version. So as you can see, the main difference is that I use the ordered tuples here to represent the hybrids. So on the left side you can see when you have here, it's combined with the location, okay, as something external. Well, you have yesterday, it's combined with time as something external. If you have I, it's combined with the speaker as something that is external. On the other hand, in the case of hybrid thoughts and in the internalistic reading, you replace those things with representations of locations, times, and agents or subjects, thinking subjects, as properly should be mentioned here. So this is a kind of a move I want to make. Now, of course, there is an issue of saying something more about the representations of the circumstances in our theory. And of course, it can be probably done in several ways. Actually, I'm kind of interested in maybe developing that idea along the theory of mental files, but I'm not doing that here. But I'm thinking about going into that direction, so any comments regarding that might be very helpful. But what I do is rather to use a kind of a theory of representations, or rather a theory of intentional objects, which is called by its author, Zalta, theory of abstract objects. So I will be talking up here about intentional objects representations. So the idea here is that actually we talk about intentional objects of various sorts, and we distinguish them from ordinary objects. Okay, so we have a microphone and we have a representation of the microphone, etc. So, and the idea is that we introduce the notion of dual predication, and this idea of dual predication says that both abstract and ordinary objects can exemplify properties, but only abstract or intentional objects can encode properties, okay? So to use the abused probably a Sherlock Holmes example, Sherlock Holmes is an intentional object, so he encodes the property of being a detective. At the very same time, he exemplifies the property of being fictional character, okay? So that's the general idea behind that view. So when we have this distinction and this idea of dual predication, we can introduce the idea of something like a representation type relative of representation. So, so this is a kind of a component of the theory of representations and contextual representations in addition to that. So we can say something like that, that certain object Y represents certain object X, if and only if X is ordinary objects, Y is abstract objects, and for each property belonging to a certain domain, which is enforced by the kind of representation we are dealing here. If Y encodes that property, then then X has it. Okay? So it's a kind of a projection of relevant properties into objects. So this is the minimal notion of representation I would like to use here. So going back to our picture, what I like to say is that we might think about those representations that occur over there in terms of this relation of representation that is peculiar to intentional objects. So that's the idea. So we might introduce here the idea of adequacy of contextual representation as well. And we might say something like that, the contextual representation, does it consist, is adequate when it represents the relevant aspects of the circumstances in which it appears. So we assume that mental representations tokens appear in a certain circumstances, and if they appear in those circumstances as represent them, we might say that they are adequate. So we might have this idea of adequacy of representations. So going back to our initial problem. So we have a hybrid thought hypothesis, and we might apply this hypothesis directly to our example. So in our scenario, on the day D prime, the day at which Pierre awakes, okay, he entertains, according to that approach, the following hybrid thought. As you can see, it's yesterday was sunny, but here in the relevant part, we are dealing with the representation of the D plus 1. That, I mean by this, the day that follows the day on which it was sunny, okay? So this is the day he thinks that is the day he woke up at, okay? So this is exactly the day. So this representation, this contextual representation is of course inadequate because he actually does not wake up on that very day, okay? But this of course is not very relevant for the analysis because we have the description of the content bearer over there. And if we have it like this, then we might very quickly realize that in that case, the content of this, what you have this, referential content, if we use this phrase, is identical with referential content of this, when this is, of course, the D representation, the representation of the initial day at which it was sunny. So there is no problem in saying that the contents of the two episodes or two thoughts are actually identical. And this is, of course, consistent with our principle of transparency, okay? And, of course, at the very same time, due to this idea of inadequacy of representation, we know that the present theory as well explains the source of the mistaken belief that Pierre's thought is false, okay? The error arises from treating Pierre as if he were not making a mistake and ignoring that he's an inadequate, in the sense introduced contextual representation. So we have a kind of explanation of that case. And so now I'm just move to the problems. So of course, this applies to our case, but this idea is not necessarily likely to be generalized to other cases like the cases of I thoughts or now thoughts or here thoughts, probably. So there is a visible asymmetry between now, I, here cases and yesterday cases. So what is happening there? So I think that this notion of representation type relative notion of representation which I introduced can be very helpful here to grasp the difference. So because that notion allows for relativization of the set of relevant properties encoded in the representation, okay? So we might say that in the case of yesterday, in the case of today, probably in the case of I and now, there are different constraints that are put or imposed on the representations. So different constraints that decide what properties belong to those that are relevant for the representation and for representing. So if we go that way, then we might say that in case of I and now, and here probably, we might say that those are the kinds of enforced kinds of representations, the subject of the thought representation, the moment at which the thought occurs representation, etc. So those are kind of enforced representations in those cases. And of course, if this is the case, they cannot be actually detached from the actual context, or rather from actual circumstances at which the thought occurs. And of course, such representations, if I am correct, are essentially rare and indexical, but I'm very happy to accept this as a kind of a consequence of that view. So I think that would be all from me, and the final slide is hybrid way of saying thank you. So as you can see, this is a hybrid thought, rather, of thanking you about your presence. Thank you very much.